Okay, so apparently I'm live, and that's pretty cool. This time I'll keep the chat open. Okay, so what I need to do, honestly, it's been several weeks since I've even looked at this, so I need to figure out where I'm at and like what it is I'm supposed to be doing now. So let's start with that. Okay, so just off the bat, it looks like I need to set the pieces because they're getting down to the bottom where they're supposed to, and then they're disappearing. So instead of disappearing, they're probably supposed to, stay there. I think last video we were able to move them left and right. So rotating is another thing we need to do, and also at some point in the near future, code clean, lots of code cleaning. In fact, I think I'm probably, once I prove all of the features out, I think what I said was I'm going to refactor it. So basically just ignore the code for now. It's going to change later once I prove all of this out and make sure that I actually am doing something that makes sense. So cool. So let's start off with rotating. What I'm going to do is like a 2D array rotate JavaScript. I'm going to see if I can find a good algorithm for this. Let's see. Transposing. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Yep. So what we want to do is we essentially want to rotate. Oh, and by the way, guys, again, this is not a tutorial. This is just me coding Tetris. So if you're new to this live experiment thing that I'm doing, I'm basically just trying to code Tetris for fun, and I'm doing it live. So if you're here for a tutorial, unfortunately, that is not what this is. But I am still going to be explaining what I'm doing as I do it. So what I want to do is rotate these 2D arrays. These are the shapes. These are the blocks that are falling, and I want to rotate them. Transpose, I guess, is the better word here. And I'm looking for an algorithm that will do it for me. And let's see, it says, okay, so what is this loop doing? I guess this is a transpose. Let's take a look. Const transpose. Okay, so apparently this function will transpose the array, but I don't know. I haven't tried it yet. But it does have 200 upvotes on Stack Overflow, so let's go to where we press the up button, because I think arrow up here is where we're going to want to rotate. So let's call that function let's transpose something simple. Let's transpose this one. This is the T block. So I think we would expect, let's see, what we would expect is an array that looks like this. So it'd be like 1, 0, and then 1, 1, and then 1, 0. It depends on if it does it clockwise or counterclockwise, but we would expect either this or the opposite if we call it with the T block. So let's do that. And what is it? T block dot shape. So let's log that. Where are we? So let's console.log transpose T block dot shape. I don't know why I did that. Cool. Let's see what happens. Oh, I probably need to have my console window up. All right, so when I press up, it works. Cool. So this transpose function works. Excellent. And it looks like it's non-mutative, like it does not mutate the original. And I can test that by going back down here, and below where I'm logging this, I can log tblock.shape just to make sure that it's not mutating the original. Yep, it's not mutating the original. Cool. So we have a non-mutating transpose function that is exactly what we want. So what I need to do is, I guess, probably set the current piece. So where is the current piece? Do we have a variable called current piece? It's been a minute. Current piece, we do. We want to say current piece. What is it? Dot shape. Let me do a search in here to see how we're using current piece. I probably ought to be using, you know, like TypeScript or something, but I just want to, again, just prove this out. So it is shape. It's shape. So current piece dot shape is equal to transpose current piece dot shape. I wonder if, okay, so that will work, but then I need to like redraw. Maybe I don't. Let's see what happens. I don't know. Pressed up. It didn't really work. Let's try it again. Yeah, pressing up. Yeah, that's it. I think it's probably working, but we need to like redraw the piece. So let's do draw grid. I think move, these functions return a like a whole new grid, so I can't really call draw grid with it. But maybe I can call draw grid with current grid. Like what happens when we're falling? Where's the loop? Draw grid, put piece on grid. Okay. This is a nightmare. If anybody, oh, by the way, if anybody watches this and wants to, like, feels like they can code Tetris and wants to hop on a live stream with me in the future, I would love to collaborate on this. I know that I could do this a lot better if I wasn't live, but, and also if I was using TypeScript, but alas. So what I need to do is, I'm pretty sure this is working. So just to verify, I'm actually going to log the current piece after I do this. So let's do, oh man, really? You can't rotate this piece. That's like the piece you can't rotate. All right, so it is definitely rotating, but I think the problem is that for some reason, we're not redrawing the piece itself. So we need to like tell the grid to redraw, redraw the piece. Which is not, I have not built the code out to work like that. I think, which sucks. Which means, honestly, like this is proving to me again, this is not the best approach whatsoever. Like it's working, but I'm just not liking this architecture whatsoever. It's hard to read. It's just a nightmare overall. So I feel like maybe I should start refactoring. Because I could take a more object-oriented approach. The problem with taking the object-oriented approach that I had, like, that I was thinking about would be mutation. Functional programming would basically naturally allow me to not worry about that. But I can create functional methods on the object. So maybe. And also using a gaming framework would probably make this a million times easier, but nope. I got to do this in vanilla JavaScript. Okay, so current piece.shape equals transpose. So we're definitely rotating the piece. We're proving it here. Got to redraw the grid with the piece. So I'm wondering if maybe let's look at like this function here. Put piece on grid. What exactly does put piece on grid do? Put piece on grid gets the thing and then mutates the grid array. Awesome. Not really. It just resets the variable. So I wonder, Okay, so this is gonna break it for sure, but let's do it anyway. I think I know what's gonna happen. I'm gonna try to predict it. So let's do put piece on grid. Yeah, and we have to call this with draw grid, put piece on grid. This is what I think is gonna happen. Let's see if I'm right. When it's falling, I'm gonna press up and it's gonna rotate, but it's gonna draw it back at the top of the grid. Let's see if I'm right. Yep, I am correct. Wow. I am correct. And also incorrect at the same time. What is this? What is happening here? Anyway, yeah, not quite what we want here. I'm thinking a refactor. I'm thinking like I proved out some of the features, but this is not beautiful whatsoever. So I'm thinking a full-on refactor immediately. Let's do that. So I like this concept. I like the concept of having the blocks here with a type and a shape. What I don't like is that I need this to have an extra dimension. Not a fan of that. So I'm going to get rid of that. Extra dimension on the, not extra dimension, the extra index on the two-dimensional array here for the I block. I didn't like that, the fact that it looked like that. I put it there to patch a bug, and I shouldn't have done that. That is not the way to code. So what I'm going to have to do, and I feel pressured to move quickly too because I'm live, and this is part of the challenge, right? It's challenging. But I need to do this correctly. So I can keep this transpose function, grid blueprint. I think I can keep this. What does this do? Maybe I can rename this function though. Grid blueprint, where is this used? Grid equals grid blueprint. So I need to document my functions too. Like that way I don't have to read the code each time. I can just put a comment here and say exactly what this function is doing, and then I don't, it's just a better practice. So this is obviously returning an array that represents the grid. So returns an array that represents, looks like the raw grid, the raw empty grid, raw empty. So the raw empty grid as 2D array, I guess. I mean, that's descriptive enough. It's just the raw grid as a 2D array. That's what this function does. Does not interact with DOM. Does not interact with DOM. So putting a comment here is a better practice, because even if like I understand this code, which I do, but I don't want to sit there for like 5 seconds or 10 seconds trying to figure out what it does, I could just read this comment in like 1 second. Or if somebody else wants to read this code and this confuses them in any way, they can just read this comment. It is better to comment your code. So I'm going to do that. Now this is where I think some of the changes are going to have to happen. Now this I'm going to keep, so I'm going to put this towards the top. So everything above here I'm going to keep. So I'm going to put some spaces here, and let me find the other. Yeah, I feel like I should keep this function too. Let me full screen this. We don't need to look at the browser right now. I think I'm going to keep this function. So we'll put this up here as well. Because really it's just like a pure function. It's not really, because it generates random pieces. So it's definitely not a pure function, but it doesn't really have any like DOM. It's not doing anything with the DOM. It's not mutating anything. It's just returning a item from an array. So this is a pretty good function to keep. This is a good function to keep. This is a good function to keep. And I like the structure of these, so keeping all that. This is a good function to keep too, so I'll keep that. I think that might be all of the things I want to keep, and then the rest of this is going to get refactored. No, we can keep this. Init controls, because we can get rid of this and put comments here like arrow right, move, piece to right. Obviously this one is move piece to left. And then this is rotate piece. And I feel like this function is fine. So document.edit, listener key down, key code, yep. Yep, so we can keep that function. What else? Maybe init grid. Let's take a look at this. Let's bring this up here. Have a look at it. So we can't keep this piece because, well, yeah, we can because we're keeping this function. Grid blueprint, I feel like I need to rename this function. Even though, let's see, returns an array that represents the raw empty grid as a 2D array, does not interact with DOM. Grid blueprint. I feel like I need to rename this because it's just looking at this function name isn't like, it's not immediately obvious what this is doing. So maybe like get raw grid as array. That's a little too descriptive, but you know what? Yeah, let's say get raw grid as array. That's what I'm going to call it, because at least then whenever I see it in code, I'll know what it does immediately. So get raw grid as array. That's what I'm going to call it. Grid L. So that's, to me, that's easy to understand as the grid element. And it's just grabbing the grid element from the document here. And then it says the inner HTML is an empty string. Now, the reason why we're doing that is because we're clearing the grid. I don't feel like that's immediately obvious when looking at this, like, hey, why are we setting the inner HTML to an empty string? I feel like maybe a more kind of declarative approach for naming things in this code will be a good way to do it. So maybe I can extend the prototype of this. Maybe that's not a good idea. Can we do that? I kind of want to try. Inner HTML. Is that even a thing? It says it is. Property inner HTML grid element is an HTML element. And the property, so what we... Gotcha. So we want to say HTML element. So I'm going to create a prototype here on the HTML element class. That's, and we'll say, we'll call it prototype dot clear grid. It's probably not a good practice, guys. I mean, it is in my case because it's helpful for me, but don't just go around doing this. And what this is going to do is it's going to say this dot inner HTML is equal to an empty string. And I feel like that's going to work, but I haven't tested it yet. And then I can just say grid L dot clear HTML, or clear grid, sorry. And that is so much more obvious what it does. It's like that clears the grid and it doesn't look like this. To me, that's it. It's better to do this. So this dot, oh, do I need to pass, it's been a second since I've done prototypes in JavaScript. I need to test and see if this actually works. I'm going to comment like all this code out because we're not using this stuff anymore anyway. Wow. Okay. So let's say, let's comment this stuff out too. So let's look at this. Let's say grid L dot, dot inner HTML. And let's just set that equal to like ABC. Oh gosh, just like a bunch of random stuff. And I'm going to comment this out and make sure that that actually does what I would expect it to. It looks like it sort of didn't. Or did it? It'd be nice if this got out of the way. All right, let's look. Certainly didn't. Probably because I didn't call the function. That might help. Cool, yeah, now it worked. So let's see what happens when I now call this. Yeah, that does not work. Now, why is that? Is it because I need to, what is it I have to do? Put this in here? No, that's not how it works. I need to look at an example of a prototype. I can't believe that. JavaScript prototype example. Preferably this. I just need to look at one. Just like, show me a piece of code. I don't want to read about all this. Come on. There we go. Oh, I'm so dumb right now. Gosh, arrow functions don't have, oh gosh. Okay. Totally forgot about that. Arrow functions in JavaScript do not have the idea, the concept of this. It's, we have to use a function expression for that. So now it works, cool. Sorry about that confusion. Sometimes you forget things. All right, so now we have a method on the HTML element prototype called clear grid that I can call, which will clear the grid. Cool. That is so much better. And I should do that for the rest of the code too. Like as I'm coding through it, I should try to make it as declarative as possible, which means like, or maybe that's not the best word, but just make it obvious, like by naming convention, what each thing is doing so that I don't have to deal with code that looks like this and be like, hey, what does this do? And then spend like 2 minutes reading this going like, oh, this is so annoying. Like I want to avoid that. So that's why I'm refactoring this in the first place. So init grid takes the grid, does that, clears the grid. No idea why we are clearing the grid here. Because if it's initializing the grid, it should already be clear, right? Unless we call init grid in multiple places. We don't. So there's like no reason to clear the grid here. This function will still come in handy later, but we don't need that. So so and then what we want to do is say grid.for each row const row L. So this is creating an element, and again, what I want to do is like create a prototype here. Instead of like saying document.create element.div, I would like to be able to say something like document.create Tetris square or something, or Tetris row. I don't know. Maybe not. That I might be overthinking that. This is simple enough, right? Or is it? These are decisions that need to be made now, so I don't have to redo it again in the future. Row L equals document.create element div. I could say something like document.create row. Nah, that's too much abstraction. I'm not going to do that. Row element.classlist.add. Okay. So we're adding the grid row class. Then we're taking the grid element, which is the main grid element, and we're appending the row to it. And then we're looping through each row. And for every single row, we're creating a unit. How does this even work? Because like, it looks like to me we're only doing 1 unit per row. Row.for each unit. Oh, I'm dumb. Okay, so row.for each row, not row L. So there's like a distinct difference here between row and row L. Row is the grid. So I need to be a little bit, again, more explicit with my naming here. like row from array maybe. Nah. This will be fine. It's still confusing. Maybe I'll just say like row raw. No. Screw it. But I would like to not have to redo this function. So I might, because I think in drawGrid, I also do the same exact functionality, but like slightly different. So I need to remember that. And we can follow the dry principle, which is do not repeat yourself. And we can, hello hybrid, how are you doing? Thanks for commenting. Let me know how you're doing. But yeah, so we want to follow the dry principle here. Do not repeat yourself, or don't repeat yourself. So this little piece of code, this chunk of code right here, will likely be reused. So I probably want to put this in a function, but not yet. I don't want to rush into over-architecting this yet. So instead, I'm going to keep it here for now and just make a comment like this. I'll just say to do dry. That'll remind me to not repeat myself. Cool, so let's look at what happens when I call init grid now. Unexpected string, cool. What does that mean? Line 120, oh, wow. All right, so yep, and it's the grid, pretty cool. Come on, it definitely works. So I'm thinking about this in terms of building it in like building blocks of functions, like functions that do specific things instead of trying to work my way through it like I was previously. I want to think like, what functions do I need? What building blocks do I need? And then I'm going to build these out and test them, not using unit tests, but just like manually test them, and then start building the program that way. That will be a much better way to do this, I think. So what would be the next function here? So we had like, so that inits the grid. We already have the functions for like generating a random piece and like transposing the grid. I mean the piece, so transposing the piece, in other words, rotating the two-dimensional array. So let's build out another piece of functionality here. Let's build out the functionality of displaying a piece on the grid. So like put piece on grid, maybe this function. Let's have a look at this. Let's bring this up here. So what is this doing? I'm going to full screen this so we can see all the code. Hybrid says, very good. Glad to see you're live for first time. Yep. This is like, I think this is my fourth Tetris live video, but this one is a little bit different than the other three because I was trying to prove out the functionality of this sort of the way that I was going about building Tetris, and I got to a point where the code was getting like really hard to read, so now I'm refactoring it. Cool, so put piece on grid. This is a function. What does this do? So the first thing it does is it says let grid equal get grid from DOM. So that's a function that I need for this to work. So what does this do? Get grid from DOM. Const grid equals empty array. He says, why do you need UUID here? And the reason why I need UUID here is because I'm actually going to have an ID for every single block that's on the grid. So when there's a bunch of Tetris pieces, I want a way to distinguish them from each other. So I figured a truly random ID would be a good way to distinguish each piece from each other. So that's the reason why I have UUID. So let's see. What I want to do is have a look at this function. So we are creating an empty array, and then we are saying grids row DOM is an array from all of the grid row items. And I think I want to create a prototype here. going to create another prototype, and I want to, what is the data type here? Get elements by class name is a HTML collection. Is that right? Get elements by class name returns an HTML collection. Yep. So let's extend that HTML collection dot prototype, and let's do something called toArray, or let's just call it array. And let's set it equal to a function, and what this is going to do is just say array, like return array dot from this. Yeah. So instead of doing all that, I can just say dot array. Cool. So grids row dom is equal to document.getElements by class name grid row dot array. Now we're iterating through this guy. I feel like I need to rename this. Grid rows dom is not like a, oh, I guess it's pretty descriptive. Like, it's just kind of annoying. Grids row dom, grid rows dom dot for each row data is an empty array. Row, interesting. Child nodes is, I want to do the same thing, extend this to be able to say like row.childNodes.array. But I wonder like what the data type is. What is row.childNodes? Is that a node? HTML node? That's not a thing. HTML, well, HTML collection is, let's take a look on Mozilla. Node.childNodes, node list. Okay. Node list dot prototype dot array equals, and then I'm just going to literally copy this. So now I can call array on this as well, which just converts it to an array. Cool. So units is row.childNodes as an array. Then units.for each unit. For each unit, we want to, if unit.dataset.id. So what that is saying is if the unit has an ID, then we know that it's not an empty square. We know that, whoops. I'm going to call init grid just so I can at least see the grid while I'm working on this. So if one of these squares here has an ID, then we know there's a piece on it. There's a Tetris block covering that square. So that is what this is saying. But I feel like, again, I want to be a little bit more explicit with this logic instead of like making everything seem so cryptic. It's just going to help me later on when I start getting into the more complex parts of Tetris. It's going to be way easier for me to just be able to rapidly develop those features. So where am I at? Unit.dataset.id. So a unit is a child node. So it's a, what does a node list consist of? Nodes, right? Nodes. So I can probably, and then what do we want to call this? Is Tetris block? Is Tetris block? Sure. So we'll take this functionality here. So if this dot, we'll say true, otherwise false. Cool. So now inside of here, I can say unit.isTetrisBlock. Nice. Okay, so if unit.isTetrisBlock, or maybe I should rename it is covered by TetrisBlock. That's too long. IsTetrisBlock is fine. Then row data.push, and this is an object with an ID and a type. And the ID is unit.dataset.id, which is that UUID that Hybrid was asking about earlier. And the type is the type of block it is. So like, is it an I block, a Z block, S block? Did I end up naming it? Someone like a while back said instead of reverse block, we should do S block. And I agree with that instead of reverse Z. So let's change that to S instead of RZ. Okay. So we're making progress here. You just can't see that. Okay, where are we at? So we're pushing an object with an ID and type. Type, that's interesting. Unit.classList. Unit.classList.length -1. So again, I see what we're doing here, but it's not explicit enough in like the naming convention. So it's sort of hard to tell what it's doing. So I'm going to again extend the node class here. Node.prototype, and we're going to call this like get Tetris block, or get block type. And I'm going to full screen this again. All right, so get block type is going to be a function that returns this dot, and basically this functionality here. So get block type. And then return this dot class list unit class, and this should be this. Cool. So get block type. We can be a little bit more explicit here with the naming. And then block ID. Again, we can extend node class. We don't have to do this, but it's helping me, so I'm just gonna do it. This .dataset.id, and this, okay, get block ID. And I'm not testing this stuff yet, so we may get a bug later, but we can deal with that shortly. Get block ID. Cool. Nice. I like this. But what I don't like is the name of this row data array. The name of this array, because it's confusing. Like, what is row data? You know what I mean? Like, this should be more obvious. Is he creating HTML and JS? Yes, I kind of am. I'm basically creating an HTML structure and then injecting it into the DOM, doing that inside of this function right here. And also kind of, this one is not, though. What this one is doing is, I'll put a comment above it to explain exactly what this function is doing. We want x86 assembly videos. Do you, though? Are you sure you want that? So here we're saying get grid from DOM is basically a function that goes into the DOM and returns an array. So an array representation of the grid. So what this does is it goes into the DOM, loops through the DOM, and then returns a sort of data representation of the grid. That way we can manipulate the data and then redraw the grid using essentially this function here. I want to reuse this as much as possible. Dry principle. But yeah, so that's what I'm working on right now. And the reason why I'm moving super slowly is because I'm trying to basically make this code as clear and clean as possible, because let me show you what some of this was looking like previously. It was starting to become pretty hard to read. I was not a fan of working in this code. So what I'm doing now is taking my sweet time and making things, creating prototypes with methods that have names that are very descriptive and like all that sort of stuff. So that's super easy to understand what I'm doing as I code in it, which will accelerate the development process later. So I know it's tedious now. Sorry about that, guys. I know it's probably boring, but just got to do it. Anyway, back to this. So if unit.is Tetris block, then we want to push to row data the, interesting. So the array, the grid essentially looks like this. I know this is like a terrible drawing. And if there's a block on it, then the object will have like an ID with like type and all that stuff. It'll basically have this stuff. So what I'm doing now is I'm going through and checking if we're on a block. So if we are on a block, we want that piece to, instead of being a empty object, we want it to be an object with an ID and type. Otherwise, we just want a empty object, and then we're pushing that. So I think this function is done. Whoops. I think this function is done. So in the end, this is going to return what we're calling a grid, which is a two-dimensional array. So this function appears to be done. I can cut this. I want to put this more towards the top here. Like right here ought to do it. Cool. So get grid from DOM now works. So I was calling put piece on grid, and I needed the function get grid from DOM, which now we have. So grid is equal to grid.map, and then we're mapping over the grid and doing some logic and then returning the new grid. So let's take a look at this logic. So grid.map, for each row, we're also going to grab the index, and then we're going to return. So since it's a 2D array, we have to loop through the child. And what we're saying is if row index is less than 2 and unit index is greater than 2, and see, this is the code, like this is not the type of code I like to work in. Like, what is this? I mean, I can read it and figure it out, but I'd rather it just be in English. So if row index is less than 2 and unit index is greater than 2, and current piece dot shape row index unit, I have no idea what this code does. Awesome. I think what in tarnation? What have I done? I think I might just have to like redo this logic from scratch, because I literally don't know why I wrote this. I don't know what this is doing. So that's what I'm probably going to do. So the goal of this is to put the piece on the grid, but it shouldn't be current piece. It should just be like current piece. Oh, got you. Interesting. So if current piece was a variable, then keep having to draw this out. It's so ridiculous. Let's just say we have like one of those, just like the square block. It would look like this. Yeah, so these are all the same object. I don't know if I like that. I don't know if I like that. I mean, maybe it would make more sense if it was like current piece dot top left corner, current piece dot top right corner, but each shape is different. So I don't want to do that. So I guess we will just do that. Okay, sorry. The confusion was like, instead of an empty object, you just get the entire current piece object, and there's going to be a bunch of those instead of just like current piece object dot specific piece. That probably doesn't make much sense, but anyway, so I know what this is doing now. I know what this is doing now, but I don't know what this check is quite yet. So row index is less than 2. So gotcha. So we want to start like at the top of the grid. So we want to start up here. Row index is less than 2, and unit index is greater than 2. I don't know why. Why did I write this? Yeah, I know it's still confusing. Chris, yes, modular breakdown might help. That's exactly what I'm basically doing right now, kind of. What I'm basically doing is I'm trying to think of like all of the functions that I'm going to need, all of the building blocks that I'm going to need in order to build the functionality of this. And just building these functions piece by piece and then testing that function. And then when I'm done, move on to the next function. And then once I have like a library of functions that I can use, I want to start building the actual game out, because previously I actually did have like somewhat of a kind of working prototype. Not really, but kind of. I was able to move pieces around. It would stop when it was supposed to, and it wouldn't go outside of the grid. But it was just getting like nightmarish, so now I'm just kind of breaking it down into like logical small chunks and then treating those like little pieces of Legos that I'm going to put together later. But I definitely have no idea what this is doing, so I'm sort of stuck. And I feel like I'm just going to have to redo this function from scratch, because I just don't know why I did that. So what we're doing is we're going through the grid from the top, and we are looping through each row. So essentially we're in a 2-dimensional loop. So we're looping through the rows, and then for each row we're looping through each unit. So we're essentially looping like this, and and it's not really a loop, it's an iteration. So we're iterating like this, and then we're doing an if statement. And we're saying if row index is less than 2, so 0, 1, 2. So if we're on the first two rows, here, and unit index is greater than 2, 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2. So if we're on the first two rows and we're we're on a unit that's past this area, then and also current piece dot shape row index unit index minus 3. Got it. Okay, now I see what this is doing. So what this is doing is we don't want to draw the initial piece like over here. We want to draw the initial piece at the beginning of the grid and also horizontally in the center as much as possible. So we're starting to do our checks over here. And then this part right here is saying if the current piece dot shape row index, so in other words, if, let's say, if there exists a, like you see how this one is there's only one row, but this one has 2 rows. It's checking to make sure that there's actually a row. Where are we at? And then it's subtracting 3 on the unit index, because the very first one is 3, because we're only checking on unit indexes greater than 2. Okay. Screw that. Let's do something else. Let's say Because really, we shouldn't be looping through like this. We should just, although map is beautiful because it's functional, like it's not going to mutate the original. So maybe that's why I chose to do map here instead of like manually go in and just say like, you know, use the indexes like row I, J equals bleh, you know, because then you're mutating the array, but using map, you're actually not mutating it. So let's do that. But I'm going to put a comment here. I want to redo this functionality, or I'm sorry, put this inside of a function and then name the function. That way I know what it's doing a little bit more, but let's do that. Let's create a function. I'll put it up here. Let's call it like const is in drawable area. Is drawable, maybe? Is drawable. And it's going to need 3 items, row index, unit index, and it does not need current piece because that's a global variable. So row index and unit index is all it needs. Row index, unit index. I'll put current piece up here for now. So is drawable, takes a row index, unit index, and then returns a Boolean of whether or not you can draw a piece here on the initial draw. So where was that if statement? If is drawable, row index, unit index. Cool. Now that is way easier to understand. And if I need to change this functionality later, I can look at the confusing code then. Cool. So grid return is drawable, then return current piece. Otherwise, bam, awesome. This works, I think. So I'm gonna say that this is good to go, and I can probably call init grid, and then init grid, and then maybe even try to put piece on grid. But I think I have to set current piece first. So let's just say current piece is equal to, I'm just gonna like manually put a piece in just to make sure that it does what it's supposed to do. Current piece. So what is it expecting? It's an ID and a type. Is that right? Interesting. Where is that logic? Okay. I already have that function and that function. Perfect. So I can just take this code. Perfect. Whoops. So what happens when I do this? Pretty much nothing happened. Hey. Okay, so init grid. Oh, because I didn't draw the grid, so it's probably there. Let me log the grid now. Console.log. I will log this. Let's see. Let's go inside of here. Make this big. It does not appear to be there. Okay, so the reason why is because put piece on grid is a function that returns a grid. So I need to actually set the grid with that. So put piece on grid returns a grid. Returns a grid. So we need to use this to set. So do I have a function yet? I don't yet have a function. But what I could do is pass a grid into here and then say, I'll just put, I don't know, we'll say like G for now. And I'll say G is either, grid is either G, but if here, I'll explain this. I'm having a hard time typing and talking. So I'll pass an optional variable here, grid. And if we pass in grid to init grid, then we're going to say grid is equal to the grid that we passed in here. Otherwise, we're going to say get raw grid as array. So we are in fact able to reuse this function so far. But let's see. We're going to have to do a check inside of here because all we're doing is, you know what? This might just work. I wonder. No. Well, I didn't pass it in. So let's see. Init grid. Init grid with that. Let's see what happens now. Still not there. Current piece. I'm going to log the grid here before it gets returned and then stop logging this. So it's okay, cool. So it's definitely returning the proper grid. That's good. So when we're inside of, I'm gonna remove this log here and go up to init. And below here, I'm going to log grid. Cool. So the first one should be empty, correct? And the second one has it. Perfect. So this line is working. We have a piece. Where is it? So row element, row class list, pen child row. I see exactly what's going on here. This is another classic case of my brain is fried. The logic is, gotcha. Okay, so when we put in the piece here, we need to also conditionally give some class names here. Let's do it here. If unit dot, what's a property name? ID. Let's go with ID. If unit dot ID, or do I already have that? I already have that functionality. That's different though, is Tetris block. That's different for sure. So if unit dot ID, I'm gonna start by consoling it. Cool. So perfect. So if unit.id, then what we want to do is say unit L dot class list dot add, and we want to add the class list of the type that it is. So it would be unit dot type. So that it will get the colors. So unit dot type. And I think we also want to give it the data set, right? So unit L dot dataset dot ID is equal to unit dot ID. So save that. And I think that might work. So I can come back down here and log this. Oh, that was so close. I felt it, but it was not. We're getting close though. So this, I'm going to now log, whoops. At the end, I want to log each row. Row L. Okay, so it doesn't have the class that we would expect, but it should, right? Unit L.class list add. Just doing a little debugging here. Interesting. Are we ever getting it to this point? I thought I was. Yeah, I am. So what is going on here? If unit.id, this is so ridiculous. So it has the class here. There we go. Is generating it down here. Oh, I see what's happening. I got to clear the grid. So that's why I had it before. Haha. So that's why I had this logic up here. So the first thing you want to do is, before you draw the grid, is clear the grid. So we're going to say, what was it? Grid.clearGrid. Grid. Wait, sorry. Get grid from DOM. This might need to be at the very top. We'll figure it out. Get grid from DOM. Or it does. Nope. That's what we'll do. Document.get element by ID. Grid. Dot clear grid. And I'm actually going to call that here. Good times. I definitely got it to work, but I'm having a bit of an issue with the fact that it's generating multiple grids. So when I call put piece on grid, that might be where it, let me see. Okay, sorry, I missed a comment up here in the chat. What does the spread operator do when put before a function? Generate random piece. Let's look at that really quick. I'll answer that for you guys. Get random piece, or generate random piece. Where is that? Generate random piece. I will find that for you. 1 second. Trying to figure out where. Okay, right here. Okay, got you. So this function actually returns one of these guys. It returns one of these objects. So this function returns an object, and then what that does is it spreads the properties out. So like it spreads the type and the shape out like this. So what that's basically doing is it's creating an object here, and this is saying type is get. Sorry, that's a bad way to explain it. Come on. So it spreads those two properties out, type and shape, and then adds ID property to that object. So it's just taking that object, spreading it out, and then adding the ID prop to it with it, and the value is a UUID for that ID prop. That's all it's doing. So I wanted to figure out why it's generating more than one grid, and I know it's because we're not clearing the grid. And I just got to figure out the proper spot within the code to clear the grid, and then I actually have to get off after that. So let's see. Where should I clear the grid? So I'm calling init grid, which draws the grid. Init grid draws the grid. So you would think that I should clear the grid. You would think I should clear the grid here, right? But yet when I run it, oh yeah, no, that's right. Works perfectly fine. Refresh, make sure it works again. Yep, that works. Cool. So I feel like this was more productive of a session than the other ones, just in the fact that because I was able to refactor the code, like I've already got a lot of the logic done, so it's going to be kind of like copying and pasting and then just refactoring it. But it's now like in English. I fully understand as I'm going through this. It's so much easier to be like, if is drawable, instead of reading this massive, like, where'd it go? Instead of trying to figure out what this code does, now I've got a name attached to it. So I know it says is drawable. So I'm going to stop it here. Thanks for everyone who came out. Throw me a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys pretty soon.